So a very good evening to everyone once again, and a warm welcome to all our attendees from India and overseas to the second webinar under our Combating Crisis series. As we battle the COVID pandemic and try to get the industry back on track, we bring you another knowledge sharing session themed Auto Industry Navigating Turbulent Times. As always, a brief introduction of our speaker before the presentation. Mr. Jeffry Jacob is a partner with KPMG Management Consulting Team in India. He has over 20 years of experience in market entry and growth strategies, sales excellence, M&A, due diligence, and large-scale transformation projects. He focuses on automotive and industrial sectors and has advised leading automotive OEMs and suppliers across India, Middle East, and Europe in key strategic and operational projects. Prior to joining KPMG, Mr. Jacob was global partner with Roland Berger Strategy Consultants in India. He has previously worked with Tata Strategic Management Group and also held leadership positions globally with GE, Toyota, and Lexus in the areas of corporate strategy, finance, Six Sigma, and business development. It's an honor to have you with us today, Mr. Jacob, and we thank you for your time. Some quick piece of information like the earlier webinar we had this week. All attendees have an option to chat and also share questions for the speaker in the Q&A section. I must remind you, the chat is only an informal chat and questions shared in the chat will not be passed on to the speaker. So if you have questions, please share them in the Q&A section. And after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where our speaker will first respond to some interesting questions we've received at the time of registration. And then we will take up some questions from the Q&A section based on the availability of time. This webinar is also being live streamed on Motor India's YouTube channel and also our Facebook page. So do pass on the word in case any of your colleagues and friends would like to join in. So that's all from my side. Now over to Mr. Jacob for his presentation. Jacob, am I audible? Is it audible? We're just waiting for Jacob to. Yeah. Is it audible, Jacob?
Yes, it is. So
yeah,
it got disconnected for a minute. So
not a problem. Yeah.
So all good to go?
All good to go, Jacob. Floor is yours.
Can you see the screen?
Yep. All
right. So you can still see the screen, right? Perfect. So Thank you, Pala. Good morning, everyone. So what I'll do over the course of the next 30 odd minutes is to cover some of the key topics around first, the impact of COVID-19 on the Indian and global automotive and commercial vehicle industry, the effect that has had since March. In some sense, I'll also cover what's the outlook that we expect for the current year and next year and the medium to long-term impact on the industry. We'll initially talk about the industry dynamics, and I'll have to have some slides later when I talk about the key areas for focus, especially for OEMs and suppliers, in order to tide over the crisis. How do we restart operations and what are our response strategies for the mid to long term? So impact of COVID-19 on the global and automotive industry domestically as well. So here I'll touch upon three immediate sector on OEMs, the impact on the auto component sector, as well as the medium to long-term impact. So firstly, sector needs to be seen in terms of exposure to short-term liquidity and profitability impact. Now, both of these are actually pretty severe for the Indian auto industry today. And what's worse for the Indian auto industry is that this is coming after almost 12 to 15 months of already depressed sales last year, which was due to a subdued economy, low growth in infrastructure and real estate projects, which already resulted in lower freight availability. Further, we had the NBFC crisis, the ownership cost which increased due to the increase in fuel prices and higher insurance costs in passenger vehicles, and the increase in axle load norms in case of MHCV. Now, excess capacity was already being created in the system with the norms in vehicles. So this capacity was there. For passenger vehicles, there was already weak consumer sentiments in this case. So as a result, the passenger vehicle industry fell by almost over 18% last year, and the CV industry actually degrew by close to 39%. That's close to 40%. In fact, even within that breakup, if you look at it, the MHCV industry went down by over 50%, and just the goods carrier in the MHCV went down by over 63%. So this was already a case of concern, and this COVID situation has only worsened this even further. And this is not very unique to India. If I look at the global scenario in North America for Class 8 trucks, historically, it's been highly correlated to the GDP as it is in most other countries, including ours. So initial production projections for the current year, 2020, are already now at 150,000 units versus nearly 300,000 units that it did last year. In India, the CV segment can be further hit hard in FY21. The lockdown has already impacted the freight demand for items, except essentials. Transporters will be further hit as a significant part of the fleet is stationary and off the roads today. Decrease in personal consumption hits the last mile transportation, and therefore we have business for SCVs and LCVs which are impacted. And the production loss due to this shutdown will never be fully recovered. Post-COVID, the poor liquidity situation of most companies have also meant that immediate investments cannot in both the construction, the real estate, and the mining sector. Now, three critical areas are being asked. Questions around three critical areas, and the questions being asked are: one, the supply. The key question is, when will OEMs start safely producing vehicles, and when will the supply chains get fully functional? The second area is demand, which is when will we get back to what is perceived as normal customer demand for both passenger and commercial vehicles. And the third is in terms of the investments. What do we do? Investments have already happened with BS6, and there was a lot of investment further happening for electric vehicles, investment happening for innovations, etc. Now, does that mean that this will have an impact on future sales as well? That's the other question. The fact is, if you look at auto components, as far as auto components were concerned, we are significantly dependent far beyond China. Everybody talks about China. Now, China is in fact, in some sense, getting back. But we are dependent far beyond China because China was actually only 27% of the demand. And other countries which are at risk like Germany, USA, UK, Italy accounted for another 30%. Which means our total import dependency went over to 55 to 60%. Just one question. Bala, can you see the PowerPoint screen?
Yes, Jeffrey. We just have to, we have to move to the next slide alone. We're just at impact of COVID slide.
Yeah, which is fine. There's no flickering on this now. Okay, it was flickering on my screen. So I'll move to that a little later.
Okay.
So as far as the supplies are concerned, it's almost 55 to 60% where we have import dependency on these at-risk countries. And so we are not out of the woods yet. For suppliers and many OEMs, the situation is important, not just from domestic, but also from a global perspective. If you look at the domestic scenario, I mean, of course, it's there. But in addition to plant OEM plus Europe, together with the global slowdown, is expected to impact both auto and auto component exports very severely. Export-oriented entities might actually go in for an inventory build-up, but this will again lead to a receivable stretch. So the key question, as far as exports of auto components is concerned, is when will these OEM shutdowns stop? When will they resume production and how? Not only in India, but in US and EU. So in the US, shutdowns, if you look at it, were announced around March 18, and the status at the beginning of April was that they were expecting to resume by mid to end April. But now the situation is not the same. Everybody is closed. Clearly, 100% of LV, light vehicle facilities are closed. And they're expecting now to open in May, depending on the situation and the shelter-in-place guidelines which will be there. Reopening again, maybe site by site with single shift, with reduced working days to start off. Each OEM might decide on the best sequence, on the best timing, and which plants will come online. This makes it that much more difficult for the suppliers. When we look at the next topic, which was the medium to long-term impact on the industry. So today, just in time, global networks, lean inventory, this is the mantra, and this has made the supply chain, however, very susceptible to disruptions. We saw that here, we saw that earlier with the earthquakes in Japan. So that's a matter of concern today. So there is a trend now to decrease over-dependence on one country and also to create manufacturing and engineering facilities and capacities which may be outside of China. Now, risk mitigation of the supply chain through dual sourcing strategies and flexibility of production to also shift from one plant to the other very seamlessly will gain importance, which means East European, which is nearshoring, and Asian countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and India can be benefits of this capacity creation. Going forward, you'll have COVID, which will have a significant impact on production systems and supply chain. So you might see some movement from global to local or nearshore production. You might see shifts from JIT to local warehousing options being evaluated. From having an increased amount of complexity and variance, significant reduction in variance and focus on key models, having a lot more risk management practices. So little or no revenues in the early part of the year by many suppliers and OEMs, and deferral in payments by customers, especially for component players, and fixed overall outgo will result in increasing working capital requirements for them, which poses a risk for small players with limited liquidity and a lot of financial flexibility. So that's issue that they will have to face. So from a supplier perspective also, leaving aside the OEMs, if I look at it, there are 4 to 5 trends which I would expect. One is companies with weak liquidity position, which will significantly need capital infusion. Second is consolidation, which can be expected in the domestic market. Global OEMs may look to de-risk the supply base. And the fourth is following that, also the global distributors will follow these OEMs in de-risking the supply base, and they'll also look to source from India. The market relatively will have limited impact because sales drop, there's older vehicles in the car park increase. So while there will be lesser impact on, let's say, body repairs, etc., there will be some impact on accessories and high-end after sales. But nevertheless, the impact is expected to be limited, and focus of major companies will also shift to aftermarket sales till some recovery is seen in the OE market. So what are some of the industry objectives post the stabilization? The first will be, how do these organizations respond to business challenges? Now, these challenges are around cash, around cost, around how employees will come back to work, and how do we stabilize operations post this lockdown. The preparations which need to be undertaken before restarting operations, these preparations start almost 10 to 15 days before the lockdown is open, and they would continue not just for a week, but it will continue typically for 3 to 6 months post lockdown, because the situation is not going to be that after lockdown you're going to have full flow of production, everybody can be back in the factories. So that's not the situation that's there here or in any part of the world. There will be operational, behavioral, and social changes that will need to be implemented. We'll have to keep tabs on who's moving out where within the facility. How do we maintain social norms? What are the longer-term challenges? This is also a good opportunity to look at a cleanup of the P&L, a cleanup of bad assets, and primarily what are the changes that we need to look at and institutionalize so that we become more profitable and more healthy going forward. How will these practices fit in with BCP and safety protocols, and what are some of the enablers that we need to ensure the safety of the workforce? So I'll cover some of these things, but if I look at some of the key focus areas to tide over the crisis, it's important today for clients largely to respond and not react to the crisis. In the sense that if you look at the market environment, it's a combination of several factors today that are coming from disruptions of closure of the component companies and also the travel bans. But these travel bans, I don't mean people like you and me traveling. This is also impacting this entire cascade is happening in the entire ecosystem. The system needs to be looked at, and there is a significant inability to invest in further capex. So you can look at this in terms of three landmarks. The first is immediate focus. The immediate focus here will be on value preservation, which means you look at how do you stabilize the workforce, how do you protect the workforce, how do you look at stakeholder communication, and how do you look at improving your short-term cash flow and your cost levers. The second is around value creation. That is, these are actions which can be taken to drive value creation. So you can put these foundations in place. Look at the fundamental aspects of business and the fundamental as to how we will going forward. So 6 key areas that we identify for a rapid and comprehensive COVID assessment test. First is cash. I'll talk about some of these. Second is cost and supply chain.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jeffrey. A minute. Yeah. Just one thing. I think the audio is slightly getting cut at times. So we'll just check the connectivity. Okay. And probably if we can reduce the speed of delivery, I think that might help get the connectivity in place. Sometimes if it's too fast, it might, might just kind of get flawed. Yeah.
Sorry. All right. So is this better? Can you hear now?
Yeah, I think it's better. Yeah, should be better.
Okay. So some of the 6 key areas that we need to look at are cash, cost and supply chain. We have combined them, capital, customer, employees, and an overall risk assessment and tax assessment. So when I talk about cash, I mean, again, it has 4 to 5 areas. So the first one there is the crisis cash management, which essentially means we look at implementing something like a 13-week cash flow forecasting framework, look at cash generation opportunities through tactical interventions, and we remove or defer including costs which are already budgeted and planned, and we have already got approvals for them. But this is a good time to relook at all of those and to see whether they are really necessary or not. In terms of funding and headroom analysis, which is another important part of cash flow management, we need to look at what is our accessible or available drawing power, what is the available headroom and bottlenecks for utilization, and what is our scenario analysis to meet our crisis. We look at working capital interventions in terms of supplier contracts, look at maximizing our existing payment terms, look at receivables and collection timelines, look at what is our income tax and GST payments which are due. We also look at as to what are the quick win cost reduction our STCFF with budgets and business plan as a part of the normal operations. In addition to these immediate actions, so I have sort of combined cash and capital structure together, but in addition to these immediate actions in the 12 weeks, we can use this as an opportunity in the long term to actually get a more efficient capital structure and improve the working capital efficiency as well. Now, what do you mean by optimizing capital structure? You could look at debt serviceability and adequate funding options here. We look at whether we can refinance or restructure existing debts with lenders. Do we look at inducting new lenders here? Can we renegotiate financing terms, especially security structure and debt governance? Can we diversify the funding sources, which is debt, mezzanine, or equity capital? And can we also look at non-core asset disposal or some M&A, which can be beneficial for us? In terms of working capital efficiency also, we look at reducing the cash conversion cycle and building up liquidity here, whether it's through improving operating cash cycles, optimizing inventory levels, reviewing current contracts, or assessing our requirements for fund-based, non-fund-based facilities like CBG, etc. When we move on to the cost and supply chain, I would say here we need to identify good or bad costs and accordingly segregate the discretionary expenses for rapid cost control. Having one 5-year plan or a 3-year plan does not cut it any longer because that's not agile enough for us to modify based on circumstances which will change. We are all finally figuring out what VUCA essentially means. So there may be sustained cost reduction optimization measures. Some of them for suppliers can be where we together work with them to increase their payment periods, look at low interest loans, look at penalty waiver for late deliveries, and if supply can be shifted to alternate production sites, for instance, and also support them in assessing risks for their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers through regular interactions and provide support as necessary. We would also look at redistributing or redesigning the distribution network to ensure more resilience to disruptions in the future. Earlier, whenever there was a compromise between resilience and cost benefits, especially in case of procurement, the balance is always tilted towards cost. Now the balance may actually tilt towards resilience in the supply chain. So that might be very much possible that companies might decide to pay a little more, but as long as they are flexible in the supply chain, that's what they would place more value on. When we look at the next, which is customers, as far as impact on customers are concerned, I'll just go to the next slide here. So Consumer purchase behavior has also significantly changed as a result of the last few months, and this is here to stay. This area has relatively received less attention today, but many of these changes will have a lasting effect and will remain even once things come back to normal. Few of them, if I may elaborate on. One, the first is heavy exposure and influence to non-traditional media and preference for digital channels and digital media during this extended period, both here and globally. Our companies were already moving to digital marketing. They were using digital showrooms and virtual reality, but this has significantly impacted the pace of change. For instance, even many senior citizens today who earlier were used to reading hard copy newspapers along with their cup of tea are now shifted to watching it on their iPhones or iPads, right? And this kind of behavior might stay for some more time. Typically, in such kind of behavior, once people shift online, studies say over 50% of them tend to stick to such behavior. So that's something which needs to be seen, because this will determine how advertising dollars will be spent in the future. Advertising dollars by the OEMs and also the associated component companies, whether this will move to digital or whether it will be in terms of traditional media. Preference may also shift online purchase, primarily also due to social distancing. Now, whether this has happened after SARS in China and also the way it has happened in many other countries like India, where online apparel and grocery relating and which moved on also further up the value chain to consumer durable and electronic purchases. Now, this may not even be restricted just to marketing and sales, but OEMs may actually look at digital launches. They may look at a full extravaganza of launching of new models on the on digital channels and on online media, etc. And from there, the focus will be on full frictionless digital purchase experience. This will be key here, and we have also worked with several companies to set this up for them. The second important trend here would be reprioritization of expenses. Income concerns today and pay cuts will lead to lower purchasing power. So there may be a reprioritization of what they are going to purchase. Vehicles will not be top of the agenda. So we need to see when will that move to the must-buy category. Typically, what happens with health scares and pandemics are that there's an aversion behavior, which means discretionary items may be put off for some more time till there is confidence in his income source, in his regular stream of business, or in the overall economy. So this means there's also an increasing focus to move to needs rather than wants. When you move to needs, it also means that if I was buying a car earlier and I went for a top-end model, will I now buy it with all these bells and whistles, or will I now buy the lowest variants, or will I buy variants which are just about necessary for me to work? So there could be some kind of downsizing here. There'll be this shift in wallet because foreign vacations are out, for instance, for quite some time. So there'll be some of these which will move to other areas. There is always a little bit of delay before demand comes back, and there are some contrary examples which you may have read, which is, for instance, in China after the lockdown opened in Guangzhou, one of the luxury boutiques sold almost $2.6 or $2.7 million worth of goods in one day, which was a record, which was the largest ever for a single store in China. Now, this may be some kind of a comfort luxury purchase, which may be something which is not typical. This may be something which is more extraordinary and may not happen happen or be replicated in other parts of the world. So these are things which we need to look out. The third part, which is focus on experience rather than ownership, this has already been there, especially among millennials who do not want to invest in capex heavy models. They prefer capex light models, whether it is renting a house as opposed to buying a house, whether it is car subscriptions and short-term leasing as opposed to purchasing. So OEMs have already been working on this. They have been on an experiential and learning path in terms of how do we offer mobility functions, how do we offer subscription models, etc. So this pay-per-use models will become more and more prevalent. The trend can increase as there is less commitment which is needed by the customer here. The fourth one is changes in key purchase criteria. There will be an increasing focus on health, hygiene, and sanitation for some more time. This downturn is global, right? And there's no clear end in sight, which means uncertainty is much more prolonged. And this memory will therefore linger in our minds for some more time. It's not going out as quickly as some of the other epidemics had happened, whether it's SARS, whether it's MERS, etc. This is a much more prolonged and a much more global in nature. So as a result, what's going to happen is for hygiene and social distancing, there could be shifts from car sharing to personal ownership. In China, if I look at it, for example, there was a pre-COVID survey which said that 34% of people only preferred buying a car. The rest preferred e-hailing, car sharing, and other formats. But immediately post-COVID, there was a doubling in this number. So almost 66% had a preference for personal mobility. And that's also a reason why a lot of sales immediately after the lockdown happened, right? So some of these changes will happen. But in India, since where new car purchase is still a significant expense, we need to see whether this will actually translate into new car sales as many are expecting, or whether this will shift partly to used cars, partly to two-wheelers, and partly to a lot of people working from home for some more time. There are some offerings which are already leveraging these trends. One example, for instance, is negative pressure ambulances. Now here, the air inside the ambulance is kept at a lower pressure than outside, which actually means that the airflow is unidirectional, and this leads to cross-contamination being eliminated. Focus is also high by many OEMs now on high-performance cockpits, adding additional filters for air purification, disinfection, etc. And these are being preferred in some markets. So there is a shift happening here again, as to what was not considered earlier is suddenly becoming of paramount importance. And lastly, is a fallout, which is the general shift to online purchases will drive the importance of an e-commerce and digital strategy for all industries, whether it's B2B or whether it's B2C. This will also extend to all high value and high involvement purchases, as long as the seller and the marketplace is both credible, of course. Now, one drawback of this is online purchases tend to be a little less emotional if you look at it, and more rational, because it gives you an easier comparison, online comparison of features. So brands will here have to be strong enough to connect with the customers and retain them. Alternate support channels will lead also to increased usage of contact centers, to virtual assistants and chatbots to meet even service requirements and not just sales. Now, moving on from here to the employee, we also need a comprehensive framework which covers different dimensions of the employee safety, because this is again critical once you restart operations. Now, a crisis here is defined as an employee getting infected with the COVID virus. So crisis prevention is in effect ensuring that employees are safe and sound. So companies need to do a lot of work around employee segregation. How are you going to track and monitor? How are you going to ensure that the tracking and monitoring is even effective after employees have left your places of work? How do we sanitize the facilities? How do we do the profiling of employees? And in case a crisis happens, how do we effectively manage it? How do we do the testing and the hospitalization? What are the isolation parameters, the SOP for it? What's the BCP plan in place? And how do these affected employees also slowly get back to work? How does the full organization over a period of time come back to office? Some of the enablers, of course, are what many companies have done, which is in terms of setting up a COVID helpline, having a split planning of the workforce, productivity being measured when you're at home, looking at what SOPs and what regulatory interventions and legal protection can be done. And some of the frameworks and tools that we have done, that we have used effectively to support companies in this, are some of the SOP development in these areas, looking at governing principles and policies and technology. I'll come back to that. Usage of technology to ensure all of these are monitored and maintained, and dashboards and tracking tools to a large extent. Now move on to the next section, which is restarting operations. How do we restart operations? What are some of the parameters, key focus areas that we need to look at when we restart these operations? We need to have a time-bound and well-defined set of activities already defined, right? When you restart operations, you're looking at restarting it. So if D0 is when lockdown is lifted, these activities need to start 10 to 15 days before the lockdown being lifted, and does not get over within a week or a month of lockdown getting lifted. It extends to almost 6 months, because this is a very sequential and slow activity which is happening. We need to look at three important areas: governance, employee management, and the facilities health and safety. If I look at governance, 10 to 15 days before D0 itself, we need to establish a COVID war room with representatives from the various functions. We need to share guidelines with the employees on hygiene and social distancing. How will it be when they come back to work? What are the guidelines for identifying critical employees? How do you identify IT services which can be enabled for employees to work from home? Not everybody is going to come back to work at the same time initially, so that needs to be looked at. And how do we develop guidelines for facility sanitization, employee health and safety, and whatever is communicated by the government and other health organizations? Immediately after lockdown, we need to monitor and govern the health status. We need to look at how do you reassess the employee insurance policies, etc., for all the critical resources. And within 3 months, And within 3 months, as in within those period, we also need to develop guidelines to look at limiting the employee movement across facility. People cannot walk from one part of the organization to another. You will have to also develop guidelines for reskilling and upskilling of employees so that they are fungible. And you have to develop guidelines also for employees slowly to move from those who are working from home to come back to the office. So how do you do that in a phased manner? So this and developing the business continuity and the crisis management plan becomes critical over the longer term. If I move on to the next step, which is employee management, 10 days before lockdown is lifted, we need to identify employees who will continue to work from home. We need to ensure that all the IT services are up and running completely. Because not only us, even our customers, our dealers, everybody is going to be starting operations back again once D0 starts. We need to develop a roster for all the critical employees and take confirmation from the employees on their readiness to join back to work. And once it's happened, we need to again seek daily confirmation. This is something which has to be done on an ongoing basis. Have a regular leadership connect, implement tools and enable employees who are working from home to move up, and have employee insurance policies updated. Reskill and upskill the employees, as I mentioned earlier, across all skills so that we are more fungible. We need to divide employees into team A, team B, team C, etc., which ensures that each of these teams have the required skills and capabilities, and the exposure in case one of those teams is impacted is limited to that extent. Moving on, the facilities health and safety box. Before the lockdown being lifted, we need to perform the facility sanitization, of course, and we need to ensure that all our inventories are right in place, whether it's in terms of sanitizers and ensuring that there's adequate distribution near the entry points, exit points, reception, and so on. And once we have started, we need to look at the efficient supplies and equipments being there on a continuous basis and update and implement entry and exit strategies to avoid crowding. So many of these may not even be under our control. We may be in one part of a building, but we have to ensure that there's no crowding at the gates, there's no crowding in the lift. So all of these become our responsibilities. So that's an area which needs to be looked at. This is an example of some employee profiling and segregation dashboards that we ourselves use, for instance, right? So if we have done that for others, we also track it for ourselves. So this is how we identify critical employees across the organization. We have risk profilings, which are based on their age, what are their comorbidities, what's the quarantine status, how are their location, are they working from home or from their base locations. We look at employee grouping through level and through business BU tagging. We also have sentiment tracking to ensure that the employees are provided with morale and support, etc., as needed. And what are the focus areas for learning and development here? So this becomes important. Leverage digital tools and dashboards which will help restarting the factory operations and also monitor it post the lockdown. What are some of the response strategies? These are a couple of last slides, after which we'll go on to the questions. But some of the response strategies that we have, both for the short term and the longer term. So if we look beyond COVID, we expect to see 7 key shifts, and these are important when you plan for the long term. First is the shift towards localization, which is increasing already due to an extent of nationalization across various countries, nationalistic feelings, and now it has only become even extended and got even more important with the COVID scare. So there will be a reorientation in the supply chain. Digital will get a real big push, whether it's working from home. Even going forward, working from home will be accepted in many as part of normal business practices. There will be digital channels. Cybersecurity becomes that much more important. Focus on cash will continue to be paramount, which companies have realized today in this environment when many of them do not have adequate liquidity to survive this crisis. We need to move towards variable cost models, whether it's managed services, look at what's core for the firm, what can be outsourced, what can be done by consulting companies, outsourcing companies are being given out to that extent. Building sensing and control tower capabilities and risk management in place. So that in anything that we do, we have more agility in response. And as I said earlier, the balance may tilt in favor of resilience versus immediate cost savings. But immediately, what do we do to mitigate the COVID impact? So immediately, there are, to paraphrase what I said at the very beginning, there are 3 key areas: value preservation, protection, and realization. So whether it's in terms of liquidity, cost and supply chain, employees, or our customers and strategy, there is a path that you follow. In terms of liquidity, we start with a crisis cash management. We move on to tactical working capital management. And we use this opportunity to actually have a strategic cash performance improvement across the organization. We look at all our policies and we'll see how we can actually improve this on a regular, sustained basis. As far as cost and supply chain is concerned, the immediate part, which has happened also with many firms, is a rapid and indiscriminate cost reduction right now. But from there, we'll start focusing on quick win delivery, what business improvements are sustainable, and eventually sustainable profit improvement is what we're looking at, and sustainable cost benefits. So the right investments will continue. So the right focus areas would be there. But wherever it's not needed, what can be postponed will be. In terms of employees, again, the longer term plan is to, of course, build the team again and create conditions to sustain this turnaround, because they are the people who are going to take us to the next wave again. In terms of the strategy and customers, we need to look at revisiting the strategy. How are we connecting with the customers? What has changed with customers? How do we ensure that we are in tune with customers' changing preferences? We look at mergers and acquisitions and our strategy to grow a lot more with a tighter lens. We see where can we acquire, especially if you're sitting on cash, because these are good transaction times. There may be good opportunities where you may get deals at much more better valuations than you are getting a year back. And also, vice versa, look at carve-outs of our own non-core assets or business units so that we become a little more healthier and a little more sustainable in the longer term. So on the right side, we have what we do typically in a 3-week rapid review assessment, but this covers more or less what I had mentioned earlier. So that's it from my side. Bala, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for that presentation. Yeah, so as indicated, we will go on to our Q&A. We are seeing a set of questions here, but we will start with some, as indicated, received at the time of registration. If you can give me a minute. Yeah, okay. So first one is something you did touch upon during your presentation. It comes from Mr. Bala Subramanian, Fractal Management Services, Pune. This is related to the work from home trend that is really catching up. You did touch upon it when you spoke. So demand for automotive sales is actually going to go down in FY21 and FY22. So Mr. Bala wants to understand how much will this impact the sale of electric vehicles and vis-a-vis the sale of ICE vehicles. So is there going to be a shift from ICE to electromobility is his question.
So talking about work from home, there will be an increasing tendency to work from home, and this is definitely good for the employees and for the firm, from saving expensive real estate costs and also looking at the traffic infrastructure and the perspective in major metros, right? So, but there are two things. One is this increasing trend for personal mobility, which will come in for people who are moving out. Also, once the traffic situation is a little eased out, you may have a certain amount of people working from home. People who are not considering buying cars earlier because they just hate going out and driving in this traffic may actually look at it a little more willingly. The industry was indeed affected by shared mobility replacing personal cars over the last 2-3 years, but this hygiene preference may also lead to some more increase in additional car households in the future. While on the whole, the industry will take some time to rebound, some of these positives will work in its favor. As far as EVs are concerned, we are still some time away for mass adoption of EVs. For 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, we are there. We are also cost competitive on a total cost of ownership perspective. But when we look at 4-wheelers, we are still a little away because of the infrastructure and range being severe bottlenecks. Once EVs get competitive as the battery prices fall and infrastructure is set up, their share will increase, but that's a little time away. So in the meantime, ICE cars are still going to be around. In fact, if I may expand on this a little further, because some other questions being asked also at some forums are that what will happen? Will EVs have a bright future or not? Because of COVID, oil prices are at an all-time low. So is this trend going to continue or not? I would give a global example for that. For instance, last year, globally, plug-in vehicles were over nearly 2.25 million units in sales. But this was the slowest growth that they had. It was only 9%. Previously, the growth had been in the range of 45 to 70%. The main reason for this was that China, which is typically around 50% of the market, did not shrink, but essentially grew only 3%. And this was because a lot of incentives were taken out. So EVs, of course, work largely on incentives. But if you look at Europe, so Europe was the pallbearer, so Europe grew at 44%, and that's why we still had 9% overall growth. The news is that even in March, if you look at it, when COVID was surfacing and significantly impacting parts of Europe, ICE vehicles dipped significantly in the range of 35 to 40% in US, UK, Germany, and in France and Italy around 70 to 80%. But the EV sales were up compared to the same time previous year. Of course, there's a reason for it in the sense that the customer profile is slightly different, the base is smaller, but it's an important dichotomy nevertheless. But it was up also in those areas, in those countries which traditionally have been preferring EVs, like Sweden and Norway, etc. So where the infrastructure is in place. In India, if you look at EVs, we did 7.6 lakh EVs last year, but only 600 were four-wheelers. 1.25 lakhs was two-wheelers, and the rest were all three-wheelers and e-rickshaws, right? So the FAME allocation and the government target of 40% by 2030 of private vehicles still need to be seen as to how realistic it is and how much we'll end up meeting it. But private partnerships are in place already with global battery manufacturers for manufacturing batteries, and with the OEMs in place already. We also have incentives, and these incentives will need to be continued because, as I mentioned, in China, as soon as the incentives fell, the sales fell. So this year, the government has again come back and revived the industry after COVID again by putting some of those incentives back in place. So these things will need to be done. Low oil prices again are, yes, it's a concern in terms of the total cost of ownership, but here the oil prices passed on completely to the consumer. So in that sense, it has not really impacted our cost value equation, right? So that's the case. There will be a decline in number of launches, but these launches will go up again. But this, like I said, will still take some more time. The megatrends will continue, but the speed of adoption will slowly change due to this urgency. So I don't see IC engines being immediately impacted. If at all, the speed and the adoption might slightly be pulled back a little bit.
Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm sure there are many others who are actually interested in posing questions related to electric vehicles. We'll probably try and take them if we have time. We will move on to another one, which again, one particular thing, most of these questions are kind of relevant to almost everybody here. So one very common question, what kind of a stimulus package do you think the industry would want from the government from a very practical point of view?
Stimulus again depends on how much bandwidth we have because there are a lot of focus areas that the government also needs to focus on at this point in time. But one thing which the OEMs and suppliers have been requesting the government is to fast track the scrappage policy, essentially to phase out vehicles over 15 years old. So this, if it happens, will be one of the key catalysts and can actually lead to a significant increase in sales, and the largest impact being on commercial vehicles in this case, right? Because we see this from the cities, it moves to the upcountry areas, etc. And there it continues forever till it finally breaks down. So this will be one major lever. In terms of taxes, I think the industry would be looking for a tax booster in terms of some short-term GST rate cuts or to increase demand, some deferment of payments to boost liquidity, and also increasing consumer attractiveness by either IT deduction on auto loans or further attractive rates of interest. But how much of these will come through is slightly different. In the medium to long term, also to ease the financial stress, the industry will be looking at, especially for MSMEs and dealers, in terms of developing a repayment support scheme or something of that kind. So these will be some of the measures that can be done, but ultimately it all depends on how much wherewithal we have to support each of these industries. But the auto industry is a significant part of the GDP, not only here, even globally. That's why the governments have always been forthcoming in supporting the automotive industry. It's a significant source of employment and value generation. So that will be there. So these are some of the topics that I see in terms of support that we can expect from the government.
Okay. Another popular question is on the impact on the MSMEs, because they're kind of the lifeline of our industry. and I think 3 to 4 of our attendees had a similar kind of a question. What kind of an impact do you think COVID would have on the SME auto component suppliers? And probably what are the top 3 challenges for them, and how do they overcome these challenges? If you can share your views.
Yeah, so for suppliers, like you mentioned, we do have a significant number of suppliers who are in the MSME category. For them, they're already under pressure. They are typically also, as an industry, they're under pressure because they are squeezed in between. And there will be some upheaval in this sector for sure. OEMs in many cases will try to look at and support some of their key suppliers to the extent possible, which some of the OEMs are already trying to do. But liquidity is an issue for most auto component suppliers. If you can't get bank loans in those cases, people will try to look at capital infusion either through additional debt or investment. That seems inevitable. So PE and inbound investments may gain traction amongst mid and small size companies, which have a strong product portfolio and also have OEM relationships. So companies which are already weak will not potentially be supported, but companies which have strong OEM relationships, companies which are already on the path of ACEs or in terms of new trends, for instance, who are already developing future-ready products, those are the ones which will be looked at. These are likely to also adopt a string of pearls strategy or a platform, right, to facilitate a platform play. So they may look at buying a number of these companies in that sense. Also, we have large and mid-sized players who are also sitting on cash, who are also strong, who have strong business sustainability, and who also have strong liquidity and can actually raise capital in the market as well. So they will look at value buys in products or markets which are synergistic to their long-term strategy. And they may look at buys not only here, they may also look at buys globally, which we have been doing for some time, where we buy global suppliers who either have good technology or they have good connects with the global OEMs. And the deals post this COVID scenario might, in some sense, resemble what happened after the 2008 financial crisis. Controlled deals can see an uptick, especially among inbound sales. So those are some of the key trends or activities that I see happening in the supplier sector.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure many of the MSMEs might want to reach out, probably post the webinar and get some more suggestions and guidance. Another common question, I'm trying to collate because we're receiving a number of questions here in the live Q&A section. I'm just trying to collate as much as possible and then present to you as one consolidated question. Another area of focus is on sales, vehicle sales and after sales. I think a number of people have queries. You also touched upon quite in detail about how digital retailing might become a bigger trend. So there are concerns like there's one attendee who's asked, do you think for vehicle purchase, do you see digital retailing really working, especially in a country like India, where the touch and feel, especially for high value products, is important? That's one. I'll just collate a couple more questions. Sales personnel might not be able to travel because of the social distancing and safety aspects. What will happen to the sales workforce of companies? And the similar scenario with after sales service. How do you see this entire ecosystem handling and managing the COVID impact?
Right. So we have already seen passenger vehicle models shifting globally also many times to digital showrooms being set up. There are smaller virtual pop-up reality experience centers which are set up, etc. Right. So whether it's Europe or Middle East, for instance. So it's today not as critical to really have a showroom and physical infrastructure in that sense. A lot of people still go there for test drives. But what's really important for these physical infrastructure is actually delivery and servicing. Everything can be done today virtually online or max on telephone calls. When I bought my car last year, I went to the showroom only for delivery. And that too, I had an option of not going to the showroom. They said they will come and deliver it to my house, right? So, but we went there because I also felt that you eventually need to also see where they are located. So that's the only reason why you went. So this is widely becoming an accepted model. All negotiations, people used to go earlier to the showrooms to bargain, to play one dealer against the other, etc. Now with increasing price transparency and even OEMs trying to ensure that dealers don't infringe on each other, so that opportunities are also becoming less, and the deals are already there in most of these dealerships. So all negotiations can be done on the phone for fleet purchases as well, right? Because for fleet, nobody really goes and a fleet owner doesn't say, I want to test drive the next vehicle once again. So while test drives also are offered at your place, the cars are actually delivered to your place for test drives as well. So these deals can be closed online, including financing. Now for after sales and service also, when we talk about it, these activities all of them have apps now. from booking a service on the app. I mean, I don't book it on the app, for instance, but I call them up, right? From booking on the app to doorstep collection of vehicle, and then the delivery is again done at your doorstep. And you can make an online payment. So either you can make it online from the app, or in many cases, they even carry the credit card machine, right? So all of these pretty much exist today. And today, increasingly, what's happening with the millennials and with this generation, and not just personal cars, but also for business purchases, people do not really want to spend too much time traveling when there is no additional information which is coming. Somebody buying a car for the first time may want to try 3 4 brands, etc. That's fine, but again, like I said, you don't need to really go to the center for it. So lesser physical assets also in terms of real estate improves the dealer profitability as well. So I see this increasing. It won't completely go off because we still need it. We still need that physical presence to a large extent, but we don't need to necessarily increase physical presence in direct proportion to the increase in sales that we are talking about. The other question you talked about was also in terms of how will sales be managed, and salespeople cannot travel for dealer development.
Exactly.
So a lot of dealer development and monitoring will also move online. OEMs are actually working. Even last year or even the year before last, there were some OEMs who are working with us in order to monitor and ensure how the dealer health can be tracked. Right. So OEMs will require more transparency with dealers so that they can monitor their performance going forward and get an advance warning if some of them are potentially about to fail, etc. Rather than actually wait for it to happen, because this is critical from a customer's touch point for them. So dealer trainings, conferences, workshops, all of them will move online for some time in any case. A lot of this depends on honest and transparent communication between the OEMs and the dealers. So there has to be a certain level of trust and integrity in the system. But there will be a heavy penetration of digital technology through dashboards to ensure adequate governance are in place. You will have integration with their systems, and you'll have the relevant dashboards and reports so that you can monitor the going on and the health in the dealership without necessarily having to travel and spend that much time there. So the amount that we will travel will again become less even in a post-COVID world, because we have seen that, in the next few months, we'll realize that things can be done. And then there will be a little bit of hesitancy to again go back and spend the majority of time for a salesperson to travel. So the focus will shift on there being more effective. So it can be managed, not easy, but this will certainly happen.
Right. So I think the message from your side is pretty clear. There is going to be heavy investment and focus on digital retailing per se. Yeah. Okay. Few more questions. Maybe we're closing into 5:30. Couple more important questions, which I find is common to multiple attendees. The US-China trade war and the impact on China. We're not going to really talk about the impact on China, but more importantly, how would this impact Indian auto component suppliers? Do we see more shift from China towards India in terms of manufacturing of components and also locally sourcing components in India? This is one. The flip side, how do you see COVID impacting export of auto components and vehicles out of India?
Right. So I'll come to the export part first. The export part I briefly touched upon earlier also, because it depends also when all the production facilities are going to come online, and then what are the shipping norms? How does it, how long would it take for all the shipping activities to resume, etc. So that's something we have to wait and watch. But that's true not only for India; it's true for all global suppliers. Right? Everybody's suffering through the same thing. All these OEM facilities will open, but they'll open, like I said, site by site, location by location. It will open essentially with what do you say? Certain lines may start coming online, not everything together. So that will be a little more complicated as far as suppliers are concerned. But that's the way it's going to happen, because this lockdown and immediately life after that, this ramp up will not be again like anything we have seen before. What happened during this lockdown also was this was not completely planned, right? That's not like everybody had a full plan. There was no maintenance support. There was no hibernation or mothballing, which the industry is used to. So, and now it's already a time frame which keeps extending. Now it's almost nearly 2 months. So once operations restart, there'll be significant uncertainty on also how the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 are going to be ready for it. The OEM may start, but the OEM has to also ensure that its supply base is in place. And their insolvency will be an issue. So this makes synchronization difficult and unpredictable, because different countries today are at different points on this COVID containment curve. They're all not coming online together. So that's going to take a little bit more from a supply chain perspective. If I now come to the China-US trade war, as we talked about, or the alternate sourcing today, which people are looking at, all of these are happening together. If you say, whether you say BS6, everybody's invested there, and dealerships are sitting on 6,000 crores worth of old stock, and then you have the new stock coming in. You have the exports being impacted, and you have the trade war situation. Now, India can emerge as one of the beneficiaries of this alternate investment locations, but we need to show more practical on-the-ground work to really convince the global suppliers and OEMs to invest here, as opposed to Vietnam or Southeast Asia, for instance, where the governments are actually helping and promoting quite a bit as well. So we have it. We are known as a very robust and a very developed center for auto and auto components. So it's not a matter of convincing anybody in terms of the capability of the country to do it, but the ease of business still will need to be improved a little bit further. So we do have and will end up as one of the biggest beneficiaries of this move. I still feel there have been topics about some things have shifted to other countries already and all that, but if you look at it, many of them were actually low involvement categories and lower end products as well. But for auto components, I still think India is still a very valid place, because we also have a good domestic demand, a domestic market, the talent pool, and also the ability to shift and supply to global markets, which we have done, and we have been doing that over a period of time.
Right. Very interesting. Very interesting. Another aspect you had explained in detail about health, safety, and governance internally when companies plan to restart. And I think that was explained very elaborately. And I also feel the timing of it is very appropriate, given that slow and steadily, I think companies are coming out of the lockdown. In fact, I even had a conversation with one of the leading CV OEMs today, and I think they've started their, slowly started their production, and the supplier base is also slowly getting ready. So while this is the kind of a to-do list for them internally, externally, what do you think will drive their growth, and what should they be actually focusing on to actually get over this crisis financially, and also to stay afloat and probably try to come back to normalcy over the next 6 to 8 months time maybe?
So from a financial angle, almost all the OEMs are working on it, either together or with external help. They're all working in terms of how can they boost short-term liquidity, how can they continue to stay, profitable is a big word now, but how can you essentially continue to be viable? And also, how can you extend your help to the entire supplier ecosystem? Because it's in their interest also that the suppliers do not fail, because we don't really today have a system where you have 15 suppliers for one item. You have one, in some cases two. So if any of these critical suppliers fail, it's a challenge for the OEM, because the auto cannot actually be on the street till all components are actually in place, right? So that's an area where the OEMs are working together to ensure that the suppliers are also getting on board. The second thing, in terms of externally what they're doing also, there is a I briefly spoke about, but there is a tendency to also look at what further feature offerings, etc., may be needed. There may be areas where companies are working about. This is there in China for sure. It has come in. It will come up in other parts in Europe soon, and maybe India as well, as to the filtration mechanisms, antibacterial, and those kind of materials. So all these kind of features also will start being demanded. So things which were never demanded earlier. Earlier people, if you go back 10, 15 years back, people did not even demand safety and safety features, right? They demanded things which were more, which was more showy, if I call it that way. A good music system, better headlights, xenon lights, and all those kind of stuff. Now people have become more aware, and they look at safety. You don't buy a car if it doesn't have 5 airbags or 7 airbags, etc., to a large extent. So it's moved there. So this will move further in terms of health and hygiene, where you'll also start looking at what are some of these things. If you look at it, some cars, some vehicles already have these purifier systems, etc., but they will also start advertising these. They'll also start talking about these. So these will be some of the talking points and discussion points when you start buying a new car, again, as to similar to safety, as to how many health and hygiene feature benefits it has. So that's going to be one of the other trends which we see for some time.
We'll probably take one or maybe max 2 last questions, if that's okay. I know this is almost like a topic in itself, the entire aftermarket fraternity, workshops, independent garages, tire shops, and all the roadside mechanics. What happens to all these people? How do you think they will be able to survive once the lockdown is lifted, or are they going to face severe challenges? Is it going to be a totally different ball game for them?
So aftermarket, you can hear me, right? Okay. So aftermarket in that sense, what has happened even in the previous crisis globally as well, when you look at it, aftermarket has been relatively less impacted usually. The reason for that is that new car buying gets delayed. There are more older vehicles which come into the vehicle park, cars which otherwise would be out of the park. So as a result, there will be a requirement for aftermarket services. But at the same time, very flashy gadgets and very expensive gadgets will not be looked at. So accessory sales might dip, but and initially there may be only the mandatory after sales needs which may happen, which may be the mechanical or the body repairs, etc., which will happen. But essentially after sales has always had a much slower dip than new vehicles. So to that extent, I think it is okay for people to come back to normal. It's going to take a little bit of time, everything coming back to normal. But once that happens, after sales will probably end up being one of the better growth areas for a little more time. There will be a labor availability issue because you would have seen a lot of people who work in these areas would have gone back to their native places after all those issues started, because they along with other migrant labor, etc. So those issues would happen, but hopefully these things start getting okay once we are out of the woods. So I'm talking about once we are out of the woods. So once you're out of the woods, I don't expect the aftermarket to significantly get a hit. In any case, unorganized aftermarket is already suffering to a large extent because most of the new vehicles which are coming in with higher-end electronics typically need to still go to an authorized service center. So larger scale service centers, or even the unauthorized service centers, but they have the facilities that are needed today to actually take care of today's generation of vehicles. So that trend will continue, but nevertheless, that's broadly my sense in terms of the aftermarket.
And you mentioned about shortage of labor in the aftermarket. Will that also drive digital, e-tailing for the aftermarket as well, spares, and that's catching up? Do you see that gaining traction?
Correct. So spares aftermarket is catching up. The one issue which is there in India is we are not a do-it-yourself country in that sense, but there are ways which are worked around it. The way it works around for some of these aftermarket parts are you order it, it'll actually be delivered to the closest garage or the authorized service center over there, because you may have got it at a better deal online, and then you take your vehicle there, he'll change the tire or he'll fix it and give it to you. So these kind of alternate things would work, because I'm not going to get a tire delivered to my house and change it, and then what do I do with the older tires, etc. Right? So these kind of models do work. So to some extent, yes, but eventually when you have to repair the vehicle, you need really to have that labor and equipment that's there. There are also these independent aftermarket online companies which are coming up, which you would have seen, which are also gaining traction because it saves my time. I don't have to really drive down somewhere. He comes home. In fact, he'll come down, repair the vehicle, and go on. Right, in many cases. So these trends are there, and these are fitting more into the bigger megatrend earlier also of me valuing my time and not really wanting to compare. If that's a small difference, I'm willing to pay that because the value of my time is much higher. So that's the reason why aftermarket has actually become a lot more professionalized today.
Very interesting. Yeah. One last question. I think we will be winding up with this question on second-hand vehicle sales. Because of, again, cash crunch, do we see the second-hand typical fast cars, be it also even commercial vehicles, do we see the second-hand market, picking up traction as a result of what's happening?
Yes, and the organized second-hand market is what I would put it at, because the market has steadily been moving over the past few years from the unorganized to the organized used car market, and the organized used car market has been growing rapidly. The reason for that also is that even if I have to sell today, I really don't want people to call me 5 times a day, come and check the car, etc. I might take a little bit of a hit, but just give the car off either in an exchange or to a reputed used car dealer. Similarly, also for buying, you don't want to go to many different places to try out 10 different kinds of cars. When these centers offer you reliability, they offer the 100-point check, they offer you a guarantee or warranty in some cases, and it comes with a certificate of near authenticity, if you may, right? That it's not had a bad accident and all that kind of stuff. So this trend is growing. And you also have more vehicles in the aftermarket today, which are at a far better usage levels and not lemons. Earlier, the number of lemons in the aftermarket was huge because people drove their cars till they could drive it no more, and then they sold it into the aftermarket. Whereas here now our purchasing cycle is improving, so that we may have cars in the used car market which are 3 years old, 2 years old, which have only run 20-30,000 kilometers, and therefore at a very good state, right? So that's one of the other reasons also why the used car market has picked up. So this trend will be here, and that's also a reason why there's a lot of investment going into these used car platforms as well. So you have seen a lot of PE investment getting in there. You've seen a lot of venture capital investment going into these platforms, and there's a significant opportunity for organizing this market, which is what this trend is all about.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very important takeaway as well. The organized second-hand market probably will pick up. Yeah. So thank you very, very much, Jacob, for your time and for taking up so many questions. We've tried to take up as many questions, covering as many topics as possible. And we hope, in case any of the attendees feel your question has been missed out, please feel free to reach out either to us or directly to Jeffry, and we will be happy to share our views with you. Any parting words from your side to the attendees, Jeffry?
Not especially, but this is a situation that we haven't seen before. So so there are many. Everybody can only hazard a guess as to when this is going to get over and when we are coming out of the woods. It again depends on how the situation pans out. One, as you mentioned, India is of course important, but even the global market is important as far as this industry is concerned. Especially for passenger vehicles, if you look at it, we have all the MNC companies who are in India having a significant amount of exports of passenger vehicles. For the auto component, nearly half of our business is also exports, and exports to developed countries, which are today suffering under the repercussions of this pandemic. So it becomes very important to watch out to see how the OEMs globally are responding to this, how their situation is improving, which plans are coming online, and therefore accordingly, how do we get into the supply chain system. But it's also equally important to see which of these companies need to look at further nearshore solutions or alternative supplier solutions, so that we can also plant our flag there and look at what additional growth opportunities we can take as a result of this. So that's what I would say. Thanks.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And to all our attendees, as always, thank you so much. We hope you found value in the session. And as always, we would be sharing the presentation as well as the recording of the webinar. You will receive an email with a link to the presentation on our website, and also a link to the webinar video on our video channel. So once again, we would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Jeffry for his time and for sharing his views during these challenging times for the industry. So until our next webinar, we thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay safe. Take care.